Hello, fellow fans of the TI-99. It's time to take another look at the game that pretty much invented the TI-99 RPG back in 1982, Tunnels of Doom. In the last video in this series, we looked at where TOD came from. We saw what people had to say about the game in 82 and 83, and we talked about what the game had to offer, which was a pretty great dungeon crawl for its time. But the real inspiration for this series is what happened to Tunnels of Doom in 1985. Since that year, John Benke released two new adventures for Tunnels of Doom that spread around the world, Tomb of Death and Assault the City. Then, even more importantly, he followed that up by releasing his TOD editor, so that 99ers could design their own Tunnels of Doom games going forward. The Tunnels of Doom format had been blown wide open at that point, and Benke's TOD editor turned into a top TI-99 game development tool, one even a non-programmer could use to sorta, kinda make their own RPG, set in the TI-99 4A's favorite RPG engine to boot. What the heck more could a 99er ask for? TOD editor matured over the next couple years, getting a version 2 and a version 3. Adding important fixes along the way. And more people tried their hand at creating Tunnels of Doom games as 85 turned into 86 and so on. Well, those early adventures are the main thing I'd like to talk about today. We're going to take a tour of some classic TOD adventures from 85 and 86, and see what they managed to do to make the most of the format, and in some cases, turn those tunnels into something else entirely. Kevin Kenny's Quest of the King was everyone's baseline idea of what a Tunnels of Doom game looked like, since it was the pack-in adventure everyone played from release to 85. So that was the foundation the community had to build on, in building custom scenarios. But the question as of 85 was whether 99ers could make something even better, now that the right tools were out there to do it. Or, if we couldn't do something better, could we at least do something weird enough to entertain ourselves? As far as the latter goes, I'd say the answer is yes for sure. We definitely got weird enough eventually. But we didn't really get there until 87 or so. We did though, so we'll talk about it, believe me. But for today, we're going to see what the early pioneers of the TOD adventure managed to do. Before we dig into what all that looked like and tour the library of TOD adventures, first, let's talk a bit about the game assets that make up any given TOD adventure, since those assets are what a designer has to work with to try and make something interesting happen inside the TOD engine. What anybody's going to be asking getting their hands on TOD editor for the first time is surely going to be, are changes to those assets really going to let me make something different enough from Quest of the King that it's actually going to be worth playing for its own sake? Or is anything you make going to be basically a reskin? That's really the million-dollar question. Or more like the $50 question maybe, since that's how much John Benke made off selling the Assault the City TOD game in 85. TI-99 freeware in 1985, as it turns out, not the ticket to massive financial success in the software market one might hope. Anyway, putting aside whether it made anybody rich, spoiler, it didn't, let's dig into what a Tunnels of Doom game can and can't do. And first off, one thing a TOD adventure can do is give enemies and players custom pattern graphics. Party members and monsters can look like whatever the adventure designer thinks they ought to look like, within the bounds of available tile patterns. Which means in Computer Nightmare, for example, you can now fight computers and robots, instead of just the same old spiders and rats you met in Quest of the King. Plus, you can change the names of monster types and player classes, so they fit whatever theme you're going for. So, in the battle map and on the party creation screen, player classes and enemy types are part of the flavor, which means in Dune, for example, you can have a party of Fremen, or you can play solo as an Atreides. In general, most of the text that gives the game its flavor can be changed, And that starts on the title screen, where you've got a description of your adventure that a designer can set to whatever they like. So that title text is something almost every TOD adventure takes advantage of. As in Chris Schneider's The Longest Night, where we're told, "The evil wizard Berndar has cast a spell to freeze time so he can rule your kingdom. Find his 2 spell books to break his spell and set your kingdom free, or die under his evil rule." But on the other hand, you can't create any new storytelling events inside the game itself, which is why a couple games, including Benki's Assault the City, deliver extra lore via BASIC. In a later TI-99 RPG like Legends, interacting with people and things in the game world rewards you with a lore dump often enough that tells you more about the world or more about that thing in particular. But TOD just isn't that sort of RPG. It's a dungeon crawl, and having an editor for its adventure format can't make it something it isn't. Still, there's plenty of flavor text in the game you can change, as I say. All your weapons and armor and magic items have names and stats, and designers can do whatever they like with those. So, for example, if you go shopping for a weapon in a Star Trek adventure, you won't find any bows, but you will find phasers. Dungeon phasers. Because Star Trek's what it's about. But something you can't really do is invent new powers or abilities. So Star Trek Adventure can call some of its weapons phasers, but ultimately they're ranged weapons same as any other, from the standpoint of the game. Items and enemies aren't all you have to work with, though, since you can also change most of the patterns that make up the dungeon. And the effect of those changes can be pretty huge. So, we're in Quest of the King. The dungeon hallway looks like this. In Halls of Lost Moria, the dungeon hall looks like this. So, restyling the dungeon walls is possible and can be pretty darn effective. And you can change the palette of the dungeon environment to get the right feel. In Quest of the King, this gets more sinister as you go deeper, where it starts like this at level 1, pretty cheery, all things considered. But at level 4, things do get a little more somber, and at level 9 and 10, things look downright dire. The 9918A doesn't have any real dark colors in its palette, so options aren't endless, but there are options to work with for what that's worth. Okay, so those are a few things we can do to make a TOD adventure more interesting. Things that might combine to make a TOD game worthwhile to a player who's played the original games 1,000 times before. Anybody who had Tunnels of Doom already had Quest of the King, so a lightly tweaked version of that probably wasn't going to fly in the long run. And that's all John Benke's first 1985 game Tomb of Death really was. But hopefully, TOD Editor was going to let folks do a whole lot more. So the question I'm here to answer is, with the campaign editor available for order, who nabbed it and did something interesting with it over the next few years? And how much were designers able to do with the editor to make something that was actually fresh and new? To answer that, I'm going to be looking at the games that got added to the Tunnels of Doom library in the first decade of Doom games, starting where we left off last time in '85, and continuing on through '86. I'll be getting to what happened in '87 and beyond in a later episode. As time went on, you'll definitely notice things got more interesting. The editor's tool set matured, and more of the creative minds in the TI-99 community took their best shot at TOD adventure design. But as early as it was, the game I'll begin with here isn't a bad start at all for the library. Despite being the first of the bunch I'm looking at today, it is pretty darn ambitious. And that is Walter Dollard's Quest for the King. One thing that makes this one significant is that it came out before TOD Editor did, like Benke's first 2 games. But unlike those 2 games, it doesn't seem to have gotten much attention from the community at all. It got demoed at a September '85 Pittsburgh user group meeting, and that's about it. But even if almost nobody noticed, the game is definitely impressive. Most monster graphics and names are new designs, items are all new, and a bunch of environment textures are new too. Plus, the dungeon palette is crazy, in a good way in my opinion. So, it is a pretty great early work, showing off how much you can really do to reshape TOD as an experience. An amazing start for the genre. All Quest for the King is really missing, oddly, is the one thing that nearly every TOD adventure has: title text describing the quest. It skipped by far the easiest part. Plus, calling a successor to Quest of the King Quest for the King isn't the most creative you could have gone with. But getting past those little quibbles, the content itself is brilliant. So in the long run, is QFK still worth a play? 36 years on?
You're damn right it is.
But back to Benki now. He put out 2 more adventures in '85 after Tomb of Death and Assault the City, because the man was a dungeon-making machine. And even more importantly, a dungeon maker-making machine, as we've seen. Anyway, one of those adventures became the title of the first TOD adventure collection sold through Asgard Software, and that is The Volcano Fortress. In The Volcano Fortress, the mighty Volcano Fortress holds 4 magic chests and the keys to open them. You must find them and escape alive. Benki labeled the Volcano Fortress adventure Dungeon Quest 1, so maybe he saw this one as a spin-off from the main series? Couldn't say. But in the main series, Tomb of Death is Quest 1 and Assault the City is Quest 2, so TVF is kind of the odd one out. In any case, TVF is a pretty straightforward dungeon adventure and doesn't modify Quest of the King's formula too much. It tweaks a few things here and there, and it adds some new enemies and weapons, but by and large, this is more like an expansion pack for Quest of the King than an entirely new ground-up game. Which raises the question, is this really essential TOD gaming today?
Meh, not so much.
Benki's most interesting contribution from the Volcano Fortress isn't actually the Volcano Fortress itself, though, if you ask me. It's actually Computer Nightmare, where in that adventure we get our first taste of a TOD game that's trying to do something other than make a high fantasy dungeon crawl. In Computer Nightmare, the computers have taken over the world. Your job is to travel into their base and unplug the 4 terminal output lines that connect them to the outside world. Good luck. You get to fight computers and robots here, not just kobolds and spiders and snakes and such. So this one kind of foresees how far TOD adventures would eventually stray from that high fantasy dungeon delving formula, dabbling just about anywhere else besides. And as someone who's looking for novelty, I appreciate that. But Computer Nightmare doesn't quite do a full-fledged redesign. It's still got one foot in the world of Quest of the King. So it's a step forward, for sure, towards transforming TOD into something else. But, given what came after, is it really worth your time?
I'll give it a strong maybe.
Computer Nightmare was numbered as Quest 4 in Benki's series, but we haven't seen Quest 3 yet, so might seem like something's missing at this point. But Quest 3 in a series came out the next year in 1986. Maybe he wrote it first? Couldn't say. Well, whatever happened there, in Quest 3 The Dark Tower, the story goes that the Dark Tower was destroyed many years ago, but rumor has it that great treasures were hidden in the dungeon below. Make your fortune. Good luck. I find it endearing how always Benki's adventures end their title with good luck that way. Nice to have the designer wishing you well on your journey, while no doubt laughing madly from a safe distance as you march towards your doom. The Dark Tower is a pretty conventional fantasy-themed adventure, so it doesn't stand out from the pack particularly. But it's got some interesting monster designs, so not a bad game if you just want a classic fantasy formula with a solid content refresh. Given it stays pretty close to the Quest of the King formula, though, is this one you really need to play in the present day?
All signs point to no.
There's another adventure from '86 that strayed a little further from that formula, though, and that was Michael Sally's Space Mine. This one was originally released as freeware, but got re-released by Asgard in 1988 in their Doom Games 2 package. And Space Mine gets a lot of credit in my books for almost completely redesigning most of its monsters and almost all its items to fit its sci-fi theme. There's no mistaking this one for a tweak of Quest of the King. It's a pretty thorough ground-up redesign for a new and different TOD adventure. In Space Mine, 1 to 4 players have landed at a remote space mine in search of 8 power crystals, and you need to find them to save the universe. So, high stakes, I guess. The whole damn universe, even. But more to the point, a lot of cool content in there. At character creation, you have mercenaries, psychics, mechanics, and super techs to choose from. And the sci-fi setting is pretty well fleshed out everywhere else besides. So, given my obsession with seeing Tunnels of Doom turned into tunnels of something else entirely, does this one deserve your attention?
Oh yeah, you know it.
So that brings us to the end of '86, and it's given us a really impressive redesign in Walt Dollard's Quest for the King, with that one still going with a high fantasy theme, even if it does change virtually everything within that theme. Then it's given us John Benke's releasing the Volcano Fortress and Computer Nightmare along with it, with TVF being a partial redesign, still mostly in a fantasy theme, while Computer Nightmare goes in a completely different direction. Then '86 gave us Benke's The Dark Tower, which is a fantasy-style partial redesign, but it also gave us Michael Sally's Space Mine, which I like for how fully it commits to a sci-fi themed redesign from top to bottom. After all that, 1987 saw some really fantastic work from designers who were at that point taking Tunnels of Doom into all kinds of unfamiliar territory. But Tales of Tunnels of Doom adventures from '87 onward will have to wait for next time. I promise there's some great stuff to talk about there. In the meantime, an archive of all the adventures I've talked about so far, and a lot I haven't, is linked in the description. Thanks for watching, folks. If you'd like to hear me talk about all the adventures we got after '86, hit subscribe, as I'll be reviewing those shortly, including delightful nonsense like Headline, Einstein Kidnapped, and The Shopping Trip. Looking forward to it. This is Pixel Pedant signing off.